Hey guys, Geo here. It's time for a new video. Now this is part 2 of my complete Dungeoneering guide, and this time we'll be looking at armor, weaponry and binding in Dungeoneering. Now this is still quite basic and it is still aimed at lower level Dungeoneers. Now until we get up to the higher parts of the guide, for example part 4 and 5 and 6, it will still be aimed at lower level Dungeoneers or people who haven't Dungeoneered that much. If you haven't already seen part 1 to the guide and you would like a quick introduction to Dungeoneering and a quick walkthrough of what Dungeoneering entails, then you may want to go watch part 1 of the guide. Otherwise, if you feel you're quite secure with Dungeoneering and you basically know what you're doing, you may want to watch this guide to brush up on your knowledge on Dungeoneering armor, Dungeoneering weaponry and what you can bind in Dungeoneering, a basic walkthrough of binding in Dungeoneering. Anyway guys, I hope the guide is useful for you, and like I said, it is aimed at lower level Dungeoneers, and if you have any tips yourself for other Dungeoneers or any little mini guides that you can just post in the comment section of this video, just put them in the comment section of this video. I hope you enjoy the video guys, I hope you enjoy the guide, and I hope it's useful for you. So first, let's quickly talk about the tiers. Within Dungeoneering, lots of items have different tiers, anything from food to weaponry to armor. Now there are basically 11 tiers, and for armor and weapon we have 10 tiers where the player can make the armor themselves. For example, tier 1 is Nervite. Nervite can be smithed by using various supplies around the dungeon and mining locations, and you can smith this within the dungeon. This is the same all the way to tier 10, using various levers within the dungeon and various wood and various other things within the dungeon to create the weaponry and the armor you would like. However, once we reach tier 11, this is armor and weaponry that can only be acquired by killing boss monsters, and it is a rare drop by various boss monsters around Dungeoneering. And as we're going through the different tiers, you'll notice that the requirement to wield the items improves. For example, a tier 1 dagger only requires 1 attack, whereas a tier 5 dagger requires 40 attack and so forth. And finally we get to a tier 11 dagger which actually requires 99 attack to wield. An important thing to remember is that when you're doing a dungeon, you generally will be doing complexity 6, and you'll be doing it with a team of 5 people, and you'll be doing a large floor. This means you won't start with the armor you do in complexity 1. Generally, it's not really feasible to make the armor in a dungeon. It's not really feasible to go using all the resource locations in the dungeon to be creating the armor. It's generally seen as a waste of time. However, the only armor we'll actually be using is the armor we start with. That is the armor that we bind to us, and I'll be talking about binds a little later in this guide. So the only armor we generally use within the dungeon is the armor we bind to us. However, we will receive armor drops around the dungeon from different monsters. They will drop relevant pieces of armor, and sometimes it's great to wear them. However, it is vital to remember that range armor and mage armor both have negative impacts on the melee stats of your gear. For example, if we're wearing a mage top, our melee stats will be depreciated. Which is why when you're going around the dungeon and you kill, for example, a mage or a ranger and they drop armor, it's not always feasible to be wearing this armor. However, it may be feasible for what we call a keyer in a dungeon, the person who's actively doing all the work and picking up all the keys. It may be feasible for them to wear the armor as the defense may be adequate for them, and it may help them effectively. However, for a general attacker in a dungeon, anybody generally doing a dungeon, it's only wise to be wearing the armor that's relevant to your rank. And since most people within a dungeon will be meleeing their way through the dungeon, and most Dungeoneers, I'd say 95% of Dungeoneers will be training their melee stats, and they will be using melee through a dungeon and using melee armor. That's what we'll be talking about, as that's really the most efficient way to do Dungeoneering, to melee your way through it. The general consensus is that the two-handed sword is the best weapon to be using within Dungeoneering, and this is somewhat due to the Ring of Kinship update, which we will talk about a little bit later in this video. The two-handed sword is generally the best weapon to be using, the highest two-handed sword you can use. However, there may be an exception. For example, if you have extremely low melee stats and you for some reason receive a Hex Hunter bow or a high level bow such as a Sagittarian bow, it may be more effective for you to range. But considering the majority of players will be meleeing their way through dungeons, that's what this guide will be concentrating on. The two-handed sword is a Promethean two-handed sword, and it is definitely the most seen weapon in Dungeoneering and the weapon that most Dungeoneers will have. This requires 90 attack to wield. However, if you have a considerably low attack level but you have 99 strength, it may be an alternative to bind a primal maul or use a primal maul. Okay, in the first part of this Dungeoneering guide I did talk about binds mildly, however let's go over them again now we've talked about what you should be binding in this video. At level 1 you can only bind 1 item, and you can bind a rune or ammo item as well, which we'll talk about later on in this video. At level 50 you can bind 2 items, at level 100 you can bind 3, and level 120 you can bind 4. Most players watching this video will only be able to bind 1 item or bind 2 items. Now ideally if you can only bind 1 item, you're going to want to bind a weapon, and that ideally will want to be the highest two-handed sword you can wield. If you combine two items, this is where it gets a little more complex. You will want to obviously bind one weapon and then bind a piece of armor. Now for the piece of armor, it may want to be a chestplate of some kind. For example, if you have 99 defense, you will want to try and bind a high level defense plate such as a Promethean plate, because obviously you won't have access to the primal plate until you reach a very high level dungeoneering. So if you're a high level defense, you want to try and bind the highest level chestplate you can within the dungeon. Most players will want to decide between a Shadow Silk Hood and a chestplate. Until you combine 3 items, it's ideal to have a Silk Hood bound over a plate. However, players may find it considerably difficult to obtain a Shadow Silk Hood. A Shadow Silk Hood is obtained as a rare drop from night spiders, which are found around dungeons, and they're a slayer creature within dungeons. Now they are considerably rare, however when you do see one, you usually see a couple of them, and the hoods are a rare drop from these guys. So until you acquire a Shadow Silk Hood when you combine 2 items at level 50 dungeoneering, it's best to bind the highest level plate body you can. Now the Shadow Silk Hood is one of the ultimate bind items. You will want to bind it as soon as you see it and as soon as you acquire it, but remember to bind the chestplate until you can have access to the Shadow Silk Hood until you receive one as a drop within the dungeon. Once you receive one, you can destroy the bound item you already have and bind a new item. The Shadow Silk Hood stops humanoid monsters being aggressive to you. For example, rangers and warriors and skeletons and zombies and the likes will not attack you, will not be aggressive towards you in dungeons, which makes it a fantastic bind item for getting dungeons completed faster. Needless to say, once you combine 3 items, you will want to bind a piece of armor, for example a Promethean plate body, a Shadow Silk Hood, and a 2-handed sword, the highest 2-handed sword you have ability to wield and have access to. Although there are always different weapons to take into consideration, such as the Hex Hunter bow, which is a very rare bow acquired from the 99 Slayer monster within Dungeoneering, which is super effective on mages. If for any reason you did have access to this weapon and you did receive it and you could wield it, you may want to sacrifice the piece of armor, for example the Promethean plate body, to bind this weapon. However, for most people watching this guide, that's not very relevant to you, so you should be looking to bind 2 pieces of armor at level 50, which would ideally be the 2-handed sword and the Shadow Silk Hood. Until you have the Shadow Silk Hood, a plate body. Now the item that makes a 2-handed sword particularly effective is the Ring of Kinship, which we can customize by right clicking on the Ring of Kinship in your inventory and clicking customize. From there we can select which type of class we'll be using, and generally you'll be clicking melee and you will see the Berserker one. Now once we select this one, we use the switch to button to switch to this one, and we can upgrade the melee. For example, your Berserker will be at the bottom here. However, when you spend more tokens on it, it will move up here, and this increases the damage when you're in the aggressive stance. So for weapons like the Promethean 2-handed sword, this is particularly effective, and you want to upgrade it as much as you can, for as much as you tokens as you want to put into the Berserker. Remember, you will be able to get these tokens back by using the reset option, but you'll only be able to use the reset option once. So remember to spend tokens on the Berserker class, as many as you have to spend while you're dungeoneering, and you can always take them back when you're finished. Now the last thing you can bind is ammunitional runes. Now you can basically bind 1 set of ammunitional runes, and it can be 125 of them. I have 125 laws bound, and this is because when you're in a group dungeon, you will want to be able to do the group gatestone teleport as many times as you can within a dungeon, as it will regroup you with your group basically, and it's very effective within a dungeon, and it saves you having to craft 125 law runes at the start of every dungeon, saving quite a bit of time for the whole team at the start of every dungeon. You may want to craft some other runes such as cosmics, but lords are going to be the most useful runes generally within a dungeon. There may be some alternatives like using the surge box or blast box within a dungeon. However, generally people seem to have 125 laws bound. An alternative would be to have 125 arrows bound if you're using a bow within a dungeon, for example if you have extremely low melee stats and aren't using a 2-handed sword. However, for a general rule of thumb, I would suggest anybody watching this guide tries to bind 125 law runes. You'll have to craft them or find them as a drop and right click on them and bind them, and that will count as your runes or ammunition bind item. So you'll still be able to bind 2 items at level 50 and the runes or ammunition. Runes or ammunition are considered a separate bind, but you can only bind 1 set. Thanks very much for watching this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any particular feedback or suggestions yourself, let me know in the comment section of this video. I hope this guide was useful for you, and I hope you look forward to part 3 of the Dungeoneering guide as we get a bit more in depth with Dungeoneering and we look for more advanced ways and we look at actually gaining XP within Dungeoneering as we move through the parts of the guide. Remember to rate, comment and subscribe, guys, if you enjoyed the video. If you already subscribed, then thanks for subscribing. I hope you're still enjoying my videos and I hope this guide was useful for you. If you're not already subscribed, be sure to subscribe for more RuneScape vlogs, in real life videos and more RuneScape guides. Be sure to thumbs up the video, guys, it is a massive help to my channel, and be sure to comment in the description if this guide helped you or if you have any tips yourself for other Dungeoneerers. Thanks a lot for watching this video, guys.